Just a slight warning, I have a reputation of being slightly Stalinist in my chairing, but now we'll open it up. Have we got microphones? Or yeah, okay, we got microphones over there. Could a couple of people sort of make certain they've got them? What I'll do, there is a sort of uneasy tendency for people to speak for 5 or 10 minutes. I would just ask you to say we've got half an hour and think of the arithmetic. So a reasonable democratic allocation of your time would give you about 4 seconds. I will not impose that because people will bring forward. So first term, yes, you, sir. Stephen Bishop first. Thank you.
So I'm Stephen Bishop. I wonder if Ben might answer this question that Philip posed. That is, how much of aid is driven by accountability? How much does accountability dictate how people react?
Okay, we'll take 2 or 3 in the questions, but some people may want a statement. Yes, you, sir. And I'm not going to stay on this corner, I promise. It's just that not that they've just caught my eye. Please.
I think is this microphone on? Yeah. Oh.
And could you just say who you are?
My name is Janusz Kohn, KRM. And I think that the central theme of this meeting is about problem solving. In other words, identification of an initial problematic state and its conversion into some kind of an alleviation of this state. Now, this is a universal activity of living things. Without this activity, they simply die. And it is as common as gravity in the material sphere. Now, the question is, what converts this initial state into a final acceptable state? And it is the idea of purposive system. We can wait for chance as in natural evolution, but that would take millions of years. Now, we have seen in this meeting as well how diverse and fragmented the various opinions about the activities of this system, which is as universal as problem solving. So how can we reconcile this fragmentation of views and this diversity about a system activity which is universal? So where are the fundamental universal principles? Where is the symbolism that enables us to model these systems? And this is the challenge that I am throwing open. And
very helpful.
I have got some suggestions.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to give your suggestions, but I'll pose the question to these two first. We'll have one more and then I'll look for... Thank you. I'll have one more question and then we'll look to it. Yes, young man with a beard next to a dark-haired lady in the 4th row. Thank you.
I think one of the...
Could you say who you are,
Sorry,
please?
yeah. My name's Rob Levy. I'm a researcher at CASA UCL, just around the corner. I think one of the difficulties of complexity science is that it's hard to do. We're working with large data sets, and that is kind of in itself a skill. And we're also working more and more with network analyses, and that certainly takes a bit of background and a bit of know-how. So I suppose my question is it reasonable to expect social scientists to work with something for which there's no command in Stata?
Okay. Is that reasonably clear?
Sorry.
What was the last point? No.
There's no Stata. It's social scientists use a tool called Stata, which is for statistical analysis, and it's nice and easy because every single thing that you do has its own command, so you don't need to really learn how anything works, you just type it in. Complexity science doesn't have such a toolkit yet, as far as I know. So.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'll pause now and we'll have kick off with you, Ben, and then do you, Phil. Okay, you've got 3 questions.
Okay, great. I'm gonna tackle the first and the third of those. Maybe leave the fragmentation problems alone. But no, I'll try and speak to all of them. But on accountability, it's quite interesting. You know, the smallpox campaign is an interesting example of exactly this issue, where Don Henderson famously said that the only way he was able to successfully oversee the eradication of smallpox was by breaking every rule in the WHO book. John just said to me before we started speaking, before the session started, that he's a big believer in doing things first and apologising afterwards. I think there's a real issue here around the experimentation that's allowed in aid, and I would say there's a diminishing space for that, particularly as aid budgets are increasing, and a need for a kind of top-down accountability that reinforces this simple, linear, proportional view of the world. And I think the way around it, or the way to navigate it, which I think is what underpins your question, is actually there are many contexts, many problems where that way of working just simply doesn't work. So a lot of people talk about the need for bed nets to deal with malaria. Now that's a really good example of narrowing down the problem. Malaria is an evolving problem, and it's I think somewhere in the region of 1968 we were talking about almost eradicating malaria, and should we say with the death of malaria was rather overstated. It evolved, it adapted, it's become a much bigger problem. A lot of aid agencies try and define that problem in the context of, have we got bed nets to everyone? Because that's a problem we can actually solve, and you can demonstrate some kind of upward accountability. But actually, the Lancet recently published an article which showed that if you go back to the places where bed nets were distributed 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, in many of those places, malaria is actually resurgent again. And so that's one way of dealing with it, to show that that accountability isn't a lasting accountability. It depends whether or not you want a sustainable solution to the problem. And the other thing is to say that in many contexts that aid agencies operate, fragile states, many of the issues that they're trying to deal with, like resilience or economic growth, that kind of accountability also isn't relevant to the problem. So you need to try and find ways of enabling aid agencies to experiment. And the classic way that that has been done to date is to say we will sign money over to the private sector because they're more innovative and more experimental. But actually, I suspect that's not going to be a lasting solution to the problem, and that institutions may need to get together, and this may be a problem for the public sector as a whole, to find more adaptive ways of operating. And we do it. I mean, government subsidises investment in developing new drugs, for example, where they don't know what the outcome is going to be, but there is somehow some political equation that's allowed to say we are allowed to experiment with taxpayers' money in that setting. And I think what we need to be able to do in the development context is to say there are some problems where we need to be able to take a more experimental approach. We can't simply just absorb the accountability frameworks you're imposing on us.
I think you've answered the question pretty well. Let's give Phil a chance.
Well, I guess it strikes me that maybe the second and the third question are touching on the issue of whether there is such a thing as a complexity science that somehow exists or will be created, and that will then just be applied to this problem and that. Is that a sensible way to think about it? And I know people who work in these areas worry about that problem and certainly don't seem to have any consensus about it. Is there just a standard toolkit of principles and ideas and approaches that you can then sort of crank out to this problem or that? I think we just have to say at this stage that it's not at all clear whether there will be or not. I suspect that probably isn't going to be the way that it's going to happen. But I do think that there are some generalities that one can make about many of the different systems that have been looked at in this way. And among them, I just wanted to, one that sort of springs to mind, John began by talking about how what were previously thought to be rare events are going to be more common. And actually that is a very common observation in any sort of complex system, that actually they're not necessarily rare events, because the very statistical distributions that you find in complex systems are different from those in random systems. You don't get a Gaussian distribution. This has caused some problems in economic thinking, where what are supposed to be sort of rare events have caused collapses. And I think it's becoming clear that in complexity you need to be aware of the fact that you just have different statistics to deal with and that rare events are no longer so obviously rare at all. I think that there's also the observation that things change discontinuously. I think this idea of discontinuous change, of making a small change in the circumstances of the system can create a big change in the outcome. That this is something that we see in many different systems, and that physical scientists have thought about using the concepts of phase transitions in the past. So these are just two generalities that seem to emerge, and I'm sure there will be others. But I would be wary about turning those into some kind of toolkit that you just then sort of plug in to solve your particular problem.
Okay, do you want a last word, Ben, or shall I go to another question?
Yeah, I guess on the point of it being hard to do and the need to work with large data sets, and is it reasonable? I mean, I think that there is a lot of investment in development research, and a lot of it is reinforcing this kind of what you might describe as standard operating model. I know the UK government, for example, in 2010 announced that they would be investing £1 billion in research over the decade to come. That's not small amounts of resources. And I think one of the challenges for this area of work is it's not systematically been funded by Development Aid. I don't know who funds CASA, but it's the EPSRC that's funding your work rather than DFID itself. So I think it's quite interesting. I think there's a challenge there around how we actually support this work if we're going to make it relevant and useful in policy context. But I think there's also a kind of an underlying point here as well, that there may be an analogy to draw with game theory. So game theory was developed in the 1940s and 1950s, and it's got all kinds of different applications today. Evolutionary game theory, lots of different mathematical applications of game theory, which are really important and useful. But there are also a number of principles that you can internalize from game theory, having rules of thumb that help you make decisions better. And I think you need both. You need to be able to invest in both the hard science, the data-driven approaches, and you need to be able to work out how that can support better decision making. And I think that's an area where you also need resources, so that when clever people like you come up with these apparatus and tools and approaches, we can actually find ways of saying, and this is what it means.
Okay,
and I think we need investment in both sides of that.
Okay, other questions, right. You, sir, I think you were trying to get the floor right with the first round, so I'll go to you next.
Okay, I've just heard a wonderful series of presentations, but let's look at the problem and say, can we stop, please, modelling solely after the event? Yes, we learn by our mistakes. What is the real characteristic of the human animal? And that is the ability that we have to think ahead, foresight, anticipation. Why is this relevant to complexity science? Because the greatest complex adaptive system that nobody has tackled yet is human thought. We like to argue, disagree, challenge, experiment, and be creative. It has the ability to support this problem solving by thinking a bit in advance.
Okay.
But it all happens at a meta level.
Thank you. I think that's a statement rather than a question. There's two people over there, that gentleman, and then after him, the one at the end of the row.
Hi, Harry Jones of IDI. So I think that there's been some talk, we need to develop new solutions, we need to invest in the research. But also for me, I think there are some pretty simple things, pretty simple lessons that come out of complexity, about being flexible, about building on what's there. What's your advice, Ben and Phil, for those of us who work advising aid agencies? Where's the biggest bang for the buck? And just as an anecdote, I've been working, helping a certain agency do a lot of program design recently, and it seems like these exercises go 6 months, 9 months. Some of them even try and incorporate complexity-related analysis into it, but then as soon as the money is released, it's almost like hands-off, it seems. And the bang for the buck versus of additional money going into planning versus just very simple principles about being flexible when you're implementing and learning, when you're implementing and being engaged, when you're implementing a program seems to be, yeah. So where do you think is the biggest bang for the buck, and what's your advice for those of us who work in or advising aid agencies?
Thank you. We'll pause that one and then we'll get an answer from these two any minute. You, sir, please.
Hi, I'm Lucho Osorio from Practical Action. A big part of my life I spent trying to connect frontline practitioners with these sort of discussions and topics, and in particular complexity is one of them that's been very important for me in the last years. I wanted to know a little bit more about the sort of knowledge and behaviors at the level of frontline staff. I don't know, Ben, for example, taking some lessons from the smallpox case you gave. That seems to be a very important issue, because I think we should try to avoid overburdening these people in the front line with theories and methods that maybe they don't need to know about. But if that's the case, then what's the type of knowledge and behavior we need at that level, and how we connect those people with scientists and other levels of donors and practitioners to make it work.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Right, I'll go to there, and I would just comment that the gender balance is a little curious in the questions at the moment, and that is not due to my innate bias as being an old man with a beard. So over to you, Ben, and then you, Phil.
So I think the point about only really applying these tools after the event or approaches after the event is really interesting. I think there is a big gap in what we do in development and humanitarian work generally. Not exactly related to foresight, although I think foresight is really important. We do need to get better at foresight. But actually what you get is a lot of design work, a lot of investment in theories of change and trying to get the program right up front, and then a lot of investment in evaluation. And the kind of weak piece in the middle is what we call monitoring. And actually, what's really interesting, the government has a network called around operational research, which is in the UK, the Government Operational Research Service, which is the natural home for a lot of these techniques in across Whitehall. So it's where a lot of systems thinkers reside, it's where a lot of network scientists get together to talk about how they can apply these approaches. What's really interesting is when they called a meeting last year of the operational researchers, and I tried to get into this meeting because of some work I was doing with the UK Department for International Development. They said, "Oh, we didn't invite DFID because DFID doesn't do any operational research; it just commissions." And I think that's quite an interesting. And then trying to actually look, and if you look across the board, that there is some effort being done in implementation research by the WHO, usually to try and work out how vaccines can get better down the chain. But actually, we're not particularly good at operational research. It may be that we don't have the resources for it. I mean, the operational research really grew out of military science, where you could have the equivalent of people going off in the back seat of a plane and seeing how the pilots were responding to different situations. And the military have got the resources to spend on this kind of thing. But the fact that there isn't nearly enough, and the fact that every evaluation that you can care to mention would highlight the fact that there was insufficient monitoring data for them to be able to use it to understand how the program really changed. I think this point about only doing the research after the event's really important. We need to be able to address this.
Can I pause you there and let Phil answer one of the questions?
Well, it seemed to me that most of those questions were about specifics of aid that I think Ben would be much better placed to handle. But one thing that did occur to me that perhaps several of them touched on is that I think, and John began by talking about climate change, and I think some of the lessons that are still being learned within the climate modelling community are ones that are very relevant to this situation in terms of things like how you evaluate your models. What sort of can you get the data that you need to connect a model to what you see, but also then unraveling cause and effect. And I think that's one of the most difficult things It's what you're often faced with in complex situations like this is correlations between data sets, but that of course doesn't tell you what is causing what. There are mathematical techniques for teasing out some of that information that have been developed in climate modeling, and I think will hopefully be importable in some degree to social systems. But I guess all I would say is that I think there are a lot of similarities between the two, and that climate modelers have had to confront these questions already. Of course, also about this question of prediction, that's really what we want to know. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from what they've done.
Okay, Ben, you two specific questions really over on the left.
I guess, Harry, thanks for the question about the simple lessons. I think you're right. I think the challenge is, unless you've got people at a sufficiently senior level within the organisation, they're not going to be able to create the space for flexibility. And then the standard accountability mechanisms, the kinds of things that Steve was hinting at, are going to bleed in, and actually, however good the analysis, they're going to start demanding certain kinds of results over certain kinds of timeframes. And I think the way in which we've tried to address this in a couple of operational agencies that I've been working with is to really talk about the issues that the leadership are obsessed by. So many international agencies are now talking about wicked problems at the leadership level. Wicked problems, actually, the literature on wicked problems is quite long. It goes back to the 1970s. It was arguably influenced by Jane Jacobs' work on what kind of problem a city is, which was inspired by the stuff that Warren Weaver wrote about. But they are talking about how leaders deal with wicked problems, and I don't think they have spent enough time thinking about how institutions deal with wicked problems. So I think there's this kind of emerging gap, this kind of relevance gap between what aid agencies are being asked to do by political forces, whether it's the kinds of challenges that they face, and what they're actually having to do in practice. And the place where that gap becomes most apparent is between the kind of design and implementation side. And what it actually means is that, and the implementing agencies may get a little bit distorted this, is what you need are better partnerships for delivering development outcomes, where you don't have simply commissioning agencies, because if you're advising a commissioning agency, they may well just need a log frame, and they may only need the numbers at the end of the day to inform that design approach. Therefore, you need a commission agency that has a different kind of approach, a different way of engaging with the implementer. And at the heart of the problem that you're talking about is the principal agent problem, that you've got a principal that says we want development to happen, and they pay a middleman to bring it about. And actually, we need to change that model, because there are many principals, there are many agents, and many of the problems that we face just aren't amenable to that way of doing things. And I think you have to start with the leadership. So if there's a bang for buck anywhere, it's about advocating to leadership about the need to address this. A lot of them will obviously be resilient. The point on frontline staff, I think one of the, I've written about this over a number of years, and one of the continual bits of feedback I get from people at the front line is, thank you for providing a language and a way of talking about my day-to-day experience that actually resonates with what I do, rather than the tools and approaches that are imposed on me that I have to, in a sense, invent the language to speak to the architecture. So I think to actually highlight, it's those rules of thumb or techniques that enable us to be more adaptive, to understand these approaches. I think that's really important. The other thing for frontline stuff is almost any element that they do has some degree of participatory research, and I think there's a lot of space for participatory methods to bring in these elements. So participatory network analysis, for example, working with illiterate farmers has helped reveal the pathways to economic development, the ways to get around middlemen, the way to get smallholder farmers routes to markets, for example.
Okay, I think that's
so there are lots of ways in which you can support that without overwhelming them with science.
Right, be warned, I'm going to pick female questions now. This lady here, followed by this lady, and is there a third lady? At the back. Yeah, here, right. Okay, so you're over to you.
Hello, I'm Ulrike Doud from Regent's University London. I'm just wondering, where do you see these actual experimentations? Because to a large extent, the innovation will be bottom-up, just like in any complex system. So where are the skills that allow practitioners on the ground to really move from analysis of phenomenon? So if you're talking about cities or traffic or epidemics, this is an analysis of a phenomenon, but not an analysis of an actual challenge. And if you allow people on the ground to actually look at the challenges they need to take on as a complex challenge, that allows them to actually incorporate accountability and other constraints that exist within their working environment as part of that system. So is the fact that we're looking at complexity simply in scientific terms rather than in operational terms actually prohibiting innovation on the ground? Because the aim of the model is not to describe an objective reality, but a model that allow you to operate better.
Thank you. Very clear. Yes, you, ma'am.
Hello, Liz Varga from Cranfield University. I was interested to hear Ben talking about the sort of social movement towards the middle classes, and I would say that that was actually, was that you, Phil?
I think that was John.
I think it might be me.
Well, I think you've all described sort of the movement towards a sort of a more wealthier society. But what I didn't hear was about the negative controls that actually exist within society that keep things as they are, the sort of negative feedbacks which try to get the sort of investment return on people's investments that are holding systems in stasis so that we can't allow the adaptation that a complex system would actually drive. And what I'd like to suggest is maybe in order to change mindset about becoming adaptable and flexible, that actually we push education down, not just to doctoral students, but even lower than master's students, and get people doing degrees in complexity, so that we're actually getting that mindset into people, so that when they become the policymakers and the CEOs, that they have this mindset that allows adaptation.
Thank you. Also very clear. And you, ma'am, just to your right.
Hi, I'm Maggie Ibrahim with World Vision UK. I love the topic and the conversation presently. I've struggled with this personally in two fronts. One is, does complex adaptive systems, can you be interventionist in this way of viewing the world? And should I just relinquish that interventionist mindset? And then the second is about the kind of intuition element and what we need to support for frontline staff. I think goes back to Lucho's question. Is there a way of framing some of this rather more in terms of a philosophical conversation rather than such an interventionist? And do you think that might help? I'm just wondering, because the standardized way doesn't seem to be moving very quickly in development.
Okay, right. Arithmetic here. We have 5 minutes, and there's two of you.
Okay, I'll be very quick on the point about education. I think that's right. And the Santa Fe Institute, where I've spent a couple of stints whilst writing the book, actually gets people, kids in at the age of 13 to 16 to learn about these tools and techniques. So I don't think it can begin early enough. The point at which people start learning about science, I think, is where you can actually introduce these ideas. And I think that is a really important element. Whether or not that's sufficient to change the dynamics within society is another question. Orit's point about whether or not a science-based approach. I guess my starting point was science, because it seemed to me that we needed to be able to describe the world better, if we and understand the world better before we can really try and influence it. And indeed, one of the ways in which I was trying to piece together the puzzle of complexity was trying to look at all those different settings where aid agencies had been doing things which are inappropriate, where the inevitable feedback loop in the system was basically coming back, and that was kind of the starting point. I don't think it has to be a pure scientific question. The operational research stuff which we've been looking at with DFID has been looking at, for example, trade, cross-border trade in northern Nigeria and the dynamics that influence that. It's a very operational question, and it's a way of saying, well, where do you invest your resources when you've got multiple possible entry points? What you want to do is try and create the conditions that can enable poor female traders to go across the borders better. So I think it all depends on, define the question first and then bring the appropriate methodology. And if you find that complexity tools can be relevant, then great. And if not, then leave them to one side. On the point of interventionist, I think it kind of depends on the problem and the way in which you're doing it. So, for example, there have been people that have used nonlinear dynamic analyses, nonlinear epidemiology to develop better programs for vaccinations and more adaptive, responsive programs. Measles is being the classic example. It's a poster child for nonlinear epidemiology. It's a massive issue in Niger, many parts of the Sahel, and the standard approach to vaccinate after an outbreak doesn't actually do anything at all. And the MSF brought in a number of mathematicians to sit in their operational offices in Niger and actually get the data, crunch it real time, and show the kinds of interventions that would be better. And the actual intervention, it just needed to be a little bit more responsive, a little bit more adaptive, and a bit more reflective of what was actually going on. So I think it can be used in interventionist ways, but I think you'd always have to be thinking about the implications of that. At the moment, we tend to act in interventionist ways as a kind of knee-jerk, we need to intervene. And in many settings, I mean, I know you do work on resilience, for example, and we talk a lot about now how we build their resilience. That's completely daft. Communities are resilient or they're not. We can support them to be resilient. Even in this country, we find it very hard to build resilience. On the philosophical point, I think this is my only philosophy joke. I know Foucault about Derrida, but actually, I think that there may well be useful things from philosophy. I'm not the person to really respond to that. I guess maybe there are as many things to be drawn. There are many disciplines we could draw from. I think the social psychology of aid is one of the really interesting ones. Why people get into the aid sector, what it says about them, and maybe there are philosophical elements there that we should all be spending a bit more time examining.
Thanks. Okay, Phil, and then...
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I mean, really, I thought those three questions touched on the three key issues that one needs to think about to sort of move beyond all these nice models. How do you get something that's operational, that's going to work? How do you change mindsets? How do you intervene in education, and how do you intervene in order to direct a system if that's what you feel you want to do? On the question of intervention, I'd say that it's also, I think, one of the key things to emerge from this way of thinking. It's about where you intervene, at what level. That it's not an intervention that says this is what we want to happen, and that it's not a top-down intervention. It's about thinking about how can we steer the system by changing the ground rules by which the agents involved interact with each other. How can we do that in order to get a particular outcome? We don't even know, I think, in many cases whether that's possible, but that's the level at which you're intervening. It's the level of the fundamental interactions between the actors, really, rather than a sort of a top-down intervention. But I think maybe also touching on the question of philosophy, I think, Ben, you said, well, first of all, we need to understand the science, and then we hopefully we'll know how to apply it. I think there's a real tension there, because the philosopher Nick Maxwell at UCL has recently been arguing that this is the problem with academia, that actually we're always saying we'll postpone actually doing something that will work until we understand it better. And of course, there's no end to the question of how well we need to understand something. And it's a tricky one, because if you try to do something at too early a stage, it can go disastrously wrong. But the tendency, I think, certainly within academic thinking, is to always put off that problem of converting what you've learnt about in theory into something that's going to happen in the real world. And I just think we need to identify that as an issue, and to think about how you can start to instigate change even before you comprehensively understand the system that you're working with. This is something that, of course, biologists and medical researchers are having to grapple with all the time, so it's not a new problem.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, and sorry I had to truncate you both, but you're both so excited about it that you're answering at length, and means that you can't be quizzed further. I contrast the academic dilemma with the one I encountered when I was the chief scientific advisor, which is an inference in Whitehall of saying this is terrible, we must do something, this is something, we must do it. And you will have be able to observe that activity and that inference in quite a lot of instances of policy, I'm afraid.